The Beaumont estate once stood as a monument to old Southern wealth, marble pillars, sprawling verandas, and the scent of magnolia thick as honey in the air. But to those who lived beneath its shine, it was a house built on blood. The Beaumonts had owned the land for generations, their fortune drawn from cotton and cane. Their name carried weight, whispered with admiration at church socials and dread in the quarters. They had everything except peace. By the end of the 1,850 seconds, that peace was unraveling. The mistress of the house, Eleanor Beaumont, was said to wander the halls at night, talking to herself, her candlelight flickering like a ghost through the upper windows. The master, Judge Henry Beaumont, had grown distant and cruel. Their only son, Thomas, had been sent north for schooling, though some claimed it was exile. And then there was Samuel, a quiet, intelligent young slave who worked in the main house. No one knew where he came from exactly. He'd been bought years before and kept close to the family. Too close, the others whispered. When the Beaumonts fell, people said it was because of a secret born in the mistress's room, the night Samuel crossed a line no one else dared. The night it began, the air was heavy and strange, like the world had forgotten to breathe. A storm was gathering beyond the bayou, its thunder rolling low and far away. Inside the Beaumont house, candles guttered in their holders as if protesting the heat. Samuel was in the study, polishing the brass on the judge's clock. He worked silently, his reflection flickering on the curved metal surface. From the parlor below came the faint, mournful notes of a piano Mrs. Beaumont was playing again. The same song she always played when the judge was away. Clair de Lune, slow and trembling, like someone speaking through tears. He paused, cloth in hand. Her playing had a way of stopping time. Outside, the rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder. A crack of thunder shook the shutters. The house creaked, a low groan from its bones. Samuel set the clock down and listened. There was something else beneath the sound of the storm, a voice, faint, calling his name. Samuel. He froze. It came again, drifting down the hall like a breath through the dark. Samuel. Mrs. Beaumont. He hesitated only a moment before moving toward the grand staircase. The floorboards sighed under his weight. Lightning flashed through the window, painting the hall in white and shadow. When he reached the landing, he saw her standing at the end of the corridor, a pale figure in a cream nightgown, hair loose over her shoulders. "Ma'am?" he said softly. She turned. Her face was drawn and strange, eyes glistening like glass. "Come here," she said. He obeyed, his heart pounding. She led him into her chamber, a vast room of pale wallpaper and dim candlelight. The smell of lavender oil lingered in the air. She closed the door behind them, her hand trembling slightly on the latch. "Something's wrong, ma'am?" he asked. She turned toward the window. "Everything's wrong," she whispered. "He's found out." Samuel frowned. "The judge?" She nodded. "He knows there's money missing from the estate accounts. He thinks I sent it north. But it wasn't me." Her voice broke on the last word. "It was Thomas, her son, the one sent away. I begged Henry not to involve the law," she said, wringing her hands. He said the Beaumont name would never suffer scandal. He said he'd handle it quietly. You know what that means." Samuel did. The judge's way of handling things was always quiet and deadly. Eleanor turned to him suddenly. "You're the only one who listens, Samuel. The only one in this cursed house who still looks me in the eye." He dropped his gaze. "I shouldn't be here, ma'am. If the judge comes back." She reached out and caught his hand. Her fingers were cold. "Please," she said, voice trembling. "Don't leave me alone tonight." The storm deepened outside. Wind rattled the window panes. For a moment, Samuel thought of the others down in the quarters, the laughter, the firelight, the smell of rain-soaked earth. Then he looked at her, this woman trapped in silk and sorrow, and something inside him softened. "I'll stay," he said quietly. She exhaled in relief and sat down beside the fire, staring into the flames. "Do you believe," she asked, "that a house can be cursed?" He hesitated. "I think people curse themselves, ma'am." Her eyes flickered toward him. "Then maybe I already have." The thunder broke again, closer this time. Shadows danced across the walls. Samuel tended the fire while she talked about the judge's temper, about the boy she'd lost years ago, about the guilt that kept her awake. Her words spilled like water from a broken jar. She spoke of dreams of walking through the halls and hearing weeping behind every door. By the time the clock struck midnight, her voice had gone soft. The storm was easing. She looked at him once more, a faint, sad smile on her lips. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me." He bowed his head. "Good night, ma'am." As he turned to go, she said quietly, "Samuel, if anything happens to me, there's a letter in the blue chest by my bed. Don't let him find it." He looked at her, startled. But her eyes were already distant again, lost somewhere past the rain. That night, Samuel dreamed of the house sinking, walls folding inward, glass shattering, the earth swallowing the grand white pillars one by one. And somewhere in the dark, a woman's voice whispered through the water, "The secret's yours now." When morning came, the sky was clear. The judge's carriage returned before dawn, wheels grinding against the gravel drive. By noon, Mrs. Beaumont was gone. The morning light came thin and gold through the lace curtains, touching the dust that floated like ghosts above the parlor floor. But the house itself was silent, too silent. No piano, no footsteps, no humming from the mistress's room. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, patient and cold. Samuel had been up before dawn, scrubbing the marble steps as he always did, though every scrape of the brush felt louder than thunder. When the judge's carriage had returned in the night, its wheels had whispered through gravel like bones grinding. Samuel hadn't slept since. Now, as he polished the banister, he heard it, heavy boots on the floorboards above. The judge was awake. Henry Beaumont descended the stairs like a storm made flesh. His once proud face looked carved in anger. His gray eyes gleamed with suspicion. He carried his gloves in one hand, his riding crop in the other. "Where's your mistress?" he demanded, his voice sharp enough to cut. Samuel straightened, cloth still in hand. I ain't seen her this mornin', sir." The judge narrowed his eyes. "She's not in her room, not in the gardens. Did she tell you where she was going?" "No, sir." Henry studied him for a long moment, then said quietly, "You were in the main house last night, weren't you?" The question came like a trapdoor opening beneath him. Samuel swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. I was polishing the brass clock." The judge took a slow step forward. "I see. And did you polish it in her room as well?" Samuel froze. The air seemed to thicken. "I asked you a question, boy." Samuel lowered his eyes. "She called for me, sir. Said she was frightened of the storm. I only made up the fire for her. Nothing more." The judge's jaw tightened. He turned away, walking to the window. Outside, the fields shimmered with dew. "You've always been favored," he said. "Too much so. My wife trusted you more than her own blood." "I done nothing wrong, sir." Henry looked back, his face a mask. "We'll see about that." By midday, the house was crawling with tension. The servants whispered in corners. The maids avoided the upper floor entirely. The mistress's room had been found empty, her bed unslept in, her candle burned to nothing. Only her scent lingered, that faint trace of lavender oil. Samuel went about his duties in silence, though his hands trembled. Her last words echoed through him. "There's a letter in the blue chest. Don't let him find it." He knew what he had to do. When night fell and the others had gone to the quarters, Samuel slipped back into the main house. The candles were dim. The hallways breathed with the old house's sighs. He moved barefoot, careful as a shadow. Mrs. Beaumont's room smelled faintly of rain. Her nightgown still lay across the chair, untouched. The blue chest sat at the foot of the bed, small and delicate, its brass latch glinting in the candlelight. Samuel knelt beside it. His hands hesitated over the clasp. If he opened it and was caught, he'd hang. But if he didn't, whatever truth Eleanor had died protecting would vanish with her. He flipped the latch. Inside lay a folded piece of parchment, sealed with wax. He broke it open and began to read by candlelight. The words struck like a hammer. "Is greater than, to whoever finds this. If I am gone, it is by my husband's doing. He has learned the truth that our son Thomas is not his by blood. His father is Samuel's father. Yes, the judge's own sin returned to him. He took what was not his years ago, and I bore the child. Thomas is that mark upon this house. Let the world know the Beaumont name rotted from within, long before this night." Samuel stared, heart pounding so hard he thought it would break his ribs. His eyes blurred over the lines. Thomas Beaumont was half what he was. The mistress had written it in her own trembling hand. Every letter a confession and a curse. A floorboard creaked behind him. Samuel whirled around. The judge stood in the doorway, candle in hand, face as pale as ash. "So," he said softly, "you found it." Samuel's mouth went dry. "Sir, The judge stepped closer, eyes like flint. "You think you can steal what's mine? My house? My name? My wife?" "I never—" Henry lunged, grabbing him by the collar and throwing him against the wall. The candle fell, scattering wax and flame. "You filthy liar!" he hissed. "She was weak, and you took advantage. You all do." Samuel struggled to breathe. "She was afraid of you." The judge froze. The words hung between them like smoke. Then, slowly, dangerously, he smiled. "You'll regret saying that." He tore the letter from Samuel's hand and tossed it into the fire. The parchment curled, blackened, turned to ash. "There, no one will ever know," he said, voice low. "And tomorrow, you'll be gone from this place forever." He left, slamming the door behind him. Samuel sank to the floor, shaking. The fire crackled softly, consuming the last of the letter, but not before one corner of the page fluttered free, landing at his feet. A single line remained unburned. "Is greater than, let the swamp bear witness." The truth always sinks, but never dies. That night, Samuel took the scrap of paper and hid it beneath a loose plank in the washroom floor. The storm outside had returned, whispering through the oaks. Somewhere in the dark, the judge's horse neighed restlessly, as if sensing the weight of what was coming. Samuel sat by the window until dawn, staring out across the misty fields. The house was still, but he knew it wouldn't be for long. The truth had already begun to rot its way out. By the next morning, the Beaumont plantation no longer felt like a home. It felt like a coffin with windows. The air itself had changed thicker, soured by something unseen. Even the cicadas in the trees had gone silent, as if they too were holding their breath. Judge Henry Beaumont sat at the head of the breakfast table, but he didn't eat. His coffee sat untouched, growing cold in its porcelain cup. The servants moved through the room like frightened shadows. No one spoke of Mrs. Beaumont's absence. Her name was a ghost that hung above every mouth. Thomas, the young heir, sat across from his father, pale and wide-eyed. He didn't understand the coldness that now emanated from the judge, nor why the man's hand trembled when he reached for his spoon. Samuel served the table, his movements careful, his mind spinning. Beneath the washroom floor, the last fragment of Eleanor Beaumont's letter lay hidden, a whisper of truth that the fire had failed to consume. But truth had a strange way of surviving in that house. When the judge finally rose from the table, he turned to Samuel. "You'll meet me by the stables after sundown," he said flatly. "We have unfinished business." Samuel bowed slightly, eyes lowered. "Yes, sir." But inside, something cold unfurled in his chest, not fear this time, but certainty. The day dragged on like a fever dream. The judge spent hours pacing the veranda, muttering to himself, drinking from a decanter that never left his hand. At one point, he shouted at the empty fields, as if the very land had betrayed him. By sunset, the storm clouds were already gathering, the sky bruised to violet and gray. Samuel walked toward the stables, the humid air clinging to his skin. He knew this path, he'd taken it countless times, but tonight every step felt final. When he reached the stables, the judge was waiting. A lantern hung from a nail, its light flickering across his face. In his right hand, he held a length of rope. "Do you know what happens to a liar, Samuel?" Henry asked, his voice calm but shaking at the edges. "No, sir. They hang. They swing until the truth shakes out of them." He tossed the rope over one of the beams and tightened the knot. "You'll confess before the sun rises. You'll tell me what you did with her, and who helped you." "I didn't touch her," Samuel said quietly, She was trying to save herself from you. The judge's jaw twitched. Don't you dare speak her name again. He took a step closer. Do you think I don't see what's happened here? My wife gone. My name dragged through filth all because of you. Samuel didn't move. You brought this on yourself, Judge. She wrote it down. You can burn the letter, but you can't burn the truth. The judge froze. For the first time, Samuel saw something behind the man's eyes, not fury, but fear. What did you say? I said she wrote it. The truth about Thomas, about what you done. The lantern flame jumped in the wind. Henry's breath hitched. You're lying. Samuel took a slow step forward. Ask the swamp, sir. She said, it bears witness. Hey! Henry swung the lantern at him, a desperate, wild motion. It shattered against the stable wall, spilling fire. Horses screamed, kicking against their stalls. The straw caught instantly. Samuel dove aside, grabbing a bucket, but the flames leapt higher, greedy and fast. The judge backed away, coughing, the rope still clutched in his hand. The firelight painted his face red. You've damned us all, he rasped. No, Samuel said. You did that long ago. A burning beam fell between them. The judge stumbled back, tripped, and struck his head against the stall door. The rope coiled from his grasp, half burned. Smoke thickened until Samuel could barely see. He ran to the door, pulling it open, gasping for air, but something stopped him. A sound beneath the crackle of the fire. A voice. Samuel. It was her voice. Eleanor's. Soft, calm, coming from beneath the stable floor. He froze. Miss Eleanor? The whisper came again. The letter. The truth. It's under the house. Then silence. Samuel looked down, and for the first time saw at the ground beneath the stable boards, black and glistening. Not just water. Blood, seeping upward, slow and steady, as if the earth itself was bleeding. He stumbled backward, terrified. The judge stirred, groaning, but when he opened his eyes, his face twisted in horror. What have you done? He gasped. I didn't do nothing, Samuel shouted, but the blood kept coming, filling the cracks, spreading like veins through the floor. The horses thrashed wildly, eyes rolling white. The fire raged higher, painting everything in gold and red. Samuel fled. By the time he reached the main house, flames had consumed the stables. The servants screamed and ran for buckets, but it was too late. The sky was orange, alive with the inferno. Samuel collapsed near the porch, coughing, his shirt singed and hands blistered. Behind him, the judge's shouts turned to silence. Then, over the roar of the fire, came another sound. A low groan from deep inside the house, the parlor floor. Samuel pushed himself up, staggering inside. The candlelight flickered as the boards beneath the grand piano began to buckle, rising and falling like a breathing chest. From between the cracks oozed the same black liquid, thicker now, pulsing. The blood of the Beaumonts. Samuel watched in horror as the stains spread, creeping toward the portraits on the walls. The faces of generations, men and women in oil and gold frames, seemed to warp and twist. Their eyes wept red. Then he heard the voice again, clearer this time, right beside his ear. Is greater than, the truth always sinks, but never dies. The window burst inward. Rain poured in, hissing against the fire. Samuel dropped to his knees. Miss Eleanor, what you want from me? The voice was a whisper of wind. Is greater than, tell him. The line ends tonight. When dawn came, the stables were ashes. The judge's body was never found. The servants swore the fire swallowed him whole. But beneath the floorboards of the parlor, the blood never dried. No matter how often it was scrubbed, the stain returned. And each night, as the wind rustled through the magnolias, someone swore they could still hear a piano playing faint and distant, as if the mistress herself was trying to finish one last song. The morning after the fire, the Beaumont plantation lay in ruins. A gray haze clung to the land, heavy with the smell of burnt wood and horseflesh. The stables were nothing more than a blackened skeleton of beams and ash. And in the center of it all, where the judge had last stood, the earth still steamed a single patch of ground that refused to cool. Thomas Beaumont, just 16, stood at the edge of the ruin, staring at the smoke twisting into the pale dawn. His hands shook as he held a torn handkerchief over his mouth. The servants whispered behind him, their voices low and fearful. No one spoke the judge's name. No one dared to. They buried what was left of him in a plain box behind the orchard, though some said there was nothing inside but ash and rope. That night, Thomas could not sleep. The house creaked and sighed as if it remembered what had been lost. Every room carried the scent of smoke and something else, something sour, like blood and old secrets. He sat at his father's old desk, the fire dying low in the hearth, his eyes on the whiskey decanter that had been the judge's constant companion. There was something cruelly ordinary about the sight of it now. When the wind rattled the windows, he flinched. Then came a sound faint, metallic, a soft clink, clink, clink. It came from the floor. Thomas got up, heart hammering, and knelt beside the rug. The sound came again, sharper now, like something tapping wood from underneath. He lifted the rug. Beneath it, the floorboards were stained dark. He remembered what the servants had whispered. The blood won't dry. Is well. He pressed his ear to the floor. The tapping continued, slow, deliberate. Then a whisper too low to be wind. Thomas. He recoiled, scrambling back. His breath came fast, uneven. Who's there? No answer. Only the creak of the house and the soft hiss of the dying fire. Then he saw a thin seam in the floorboard, where one plank had been pried loose before. He grabbed the poker from the fireplace and wedged it under the board, prying it upward. The wood splintered. Dust rose. Inside the cavity lay something wrapped in cloth. He reached in, hands trembling, and pulled it free. The fabric was damp, smelling faintly of mildew and iron. When he unwrapped it, a folded stack of papers slid out brittle, yellowed, their ink faded but legible. At the top of the first page, in a graceful hand, was written, "Is greater than, to whoever bears the Beaumont name when this is found, the truth of your blood is a debt that must be paid." Thomas's mouth went dry. It was signed, Eleanor Vance Beaumont, his mother. He read by firelight, his eyes devouring every line. Each word felt heavier than the last. She wrote of a forbidden love of a man, not of her station, not of her color, a man named Samuel, the same Samuel who had served in the house since before Thomas could remember. She wrote of her husband's cruelty, his fury when he discovered the truth, and how he had forced her into silence. And then she wrote of the child, "Is greater than, the boy they call my husband's son is not his. He bears the blood of mercy, not cruelty. He must never know, for the judge would see him dead rather than raised in shame. Is..." Thomas dropped the letter. His whole body went cold. He wasn't Henry Beaumont's son. He was Samuel's. He stumbled out of the study, the letters clutched to his chest, moving through the dark hallway like a ghost. The portraits of his ancestors watched from the walls, solemn faces painted in oil and gold. Now, under the flickering lamplight, their eyes seemed to follow him with contempt. When he reached the servant quarters, the door creaked open before he even knocked. Samuel stood there, his face lined with exhaustion, soot still on his hands from the fire. "Master Thomas," he said softly, "you shouldn't be here." Thomas stared at him, the man he'd known his whole life. The man who had taught him to fish, to read scripture, to ride a horse. The man who had looked at him, always, with a quiet sadness. He held out the letters. "You knew." Samuel's eyes darkened. "Not all of it. Not until last night. She wrote about you," Thomas whispered. "You and her." She said He couldn't finish. The words caught in his throat. Samuel stepped closer, voice trembling. "She wanted to tell you when you were grown. But he swallowed hard. He found out before she could." Thomas backed away, shaking his head. No, that can't be true. My father was no father to you," Samuel said bitterly. "He killed her for her love, buried her under the house where no one would find her truth." The words struck like blows. "Buried her?" Samuel nodded slowly. "I heard her that night. I tried to dig her out. The judge caught me and set the hounds loose. He said the swamp would take care of her." Thomas's vision blurred. "You're lying." "I wish to God I was," Samuel said, his eyes wet. "But you seen what that house does now. You heard her. She ain't gone, Thomas. She's waiting." That night, as thunder rolled in from the sea, Thomas went down to the basement with a lantern and a shovel. He followed the whispers. They led him to a wall behind the wine casks, a wall that looked newer than the rest, as if it had been rebuilt recently. The mortar still smelled faintly of lime. He set the lantern on the ground and began to dig. The first crack appeared after an hour. Dust filled the air. His arms burned, but he didn't stop. The wall began to crumble, brick by brick. When the hole was wide enough, he reached in and touched fabric. A dress. Beneath it, bone. And beside the skeletal hand, half buried in the dirt, was a small locket. He lifted it gently, brushing the soil away. Inside was a miniature painting, his mother, smiling, holding a child. Him. The lantern flickered, then went out. The darkness pressed close, and from within it came her voice, warm, broken, and full of love. "Is greater than, 'You found me, my son. Now, free us both.'" The earth trembled beneath him. A breath of cold air swept through the cellar. He dropped to his knees as the house groaned above, its timbers creaking like something alive. When the first scream came distant, echoing from the halls above, Thomas knew the past had finally woken, and it wasn't done with any of them yet. The storm broke at midnight. Lightning slashed through the sky, lighting up the burned husk of the stables and the wild tangle of oaks that framed the plantation. Rain came down in sheets, washing soot from the bricks, drumming against the roof like 1,000 fists. The Beaumont house stood rigid against it all, but inside, it felt alive, shuddering with each flash of light, whispering in every corridor. Thomas had not moved from the basement floor since he'd uncovered the bones. The lantern was dead. The air smelled of wet stone and decay. He stared at the wall that had once hidden his mother's grave, her locket still clutched in his hand. The voice that had spoken soft, maternal, otherworldly echoed in his skull like a fever dream. "You found me, my son. Now, free us both." But how? He rose unsteadily, the hem of his trousers caked in mud, and turned toward the narrow steps leading up to the main hall. The house was utterly dark, except for the faint glow of lightning spilling through the windows. With every step, the boards moaned beneath him. He could feel the vibration of the storm in the bones of the house. When he reached the parlor, the portraits of his ancestors loomed from the walls, faces twisted by shadow. The judge's portrait was gone. The frame hung crooked, the canvas torn down, leaving only jagged scraps that flapped with the wind seeping through a broken pane. "Thomas!" He turned sharply. Samuel stood in the doorway, drenched from the rain. His face was pale, his eyes wide with something between terror and pity. "You shouldn't be here," Samuel said, stepping inside. "The house isn't safe tonight." Thomas's voice cracked. "You knew she was down there." "I suspected," Samuel said, "but I couldn't prove it. And I couldn't—" "You could have told me," Thomas shouted, his voice rising over the thunder. "You could have told me who I am, what he did." Samuel's shoulders sagged. "And have him kill you, too? I swore to her I'd keep you safe. That's the only reason you're still breathing." Thomas trembled. "Safe? She was buried alive beneath our feet. There's no safety in silence." Samuel closed the distance between them, his expression desperate. "Thomas, listen to me. Whatever you stirred up down there, it isn't just memory. The house remembers pain. It holds it, and it doesn't let go." As if to punctuate his words, the chandeliers above them began to sway, though no wind touched them. The walls groaned a deep, resonant sound, like a beast waking. From the hallway came the soft patter of footsteps. Bare, light, almost childlike. Thomas turned toward the sound, holding the locket tightly. "She's here," he whispered. "Thomas," but the boy was already walking. He followed the sound down the corridor, past the study where his father's whiskey glass still lay shattered on the floor, past the locked door to the nursery that hadn't been opened since his mother's death. The door was ajar now, rocking gently on its hinges. Lightning flashed, and for a heartbeat, he saw her. A woman in a pale dress, her hair loose, her back turned. She stood beside the cradle, humming softly. "Mother?" The figure stilled. Slowly, she turned, but her face was not whole. Half of it was beauty remembered, The other half was bone, the socket empty, the jaw broken. Thomas stumbled back, choking on air. The room seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The walls bled faint trails of water, the paint blistering and peeling. "Do you know what he did to me?" the apparition whispered. Her voice was both hers and not hers, a dozen voices layered in grief. "He took everything. My breath, my child, my name." Tears burned Thomas's eyes. "I know. I found you. I'll make it right." She stepped closer, the air around her shimmering with cold. "Then end it. End what bears his name. End the Beaumont curse." He hesitated. "End it how?" Her voice turned sharp, filled with wind and thunder. "Burn it. Burn the blood that built this house." Samuel appeared at the door, breathless. "Thomas, don't listen to her. She's not your mother anymore. She's what he made her." Thomas turned to him, his face streaked with tears and rain. "You said the house remembers. Maybe it remembers enough to demand justice." "Justice?" Samuel's voice broke. "This place doesn't want justice, it wants company. Don't let it take you too." Lightning exploded outside, casting everything in stark white for a moment. Thomas looked between the ghost of his mother and the man who was his true father. He saw in Samuel's eyes the same quiet sorrow his mother had described in her letters, and he knew the truth had waited too long to die. He walked past Samuel, back to the study, and pulled open the cabinet where the judge had kept the oil lamps. "Thomas," Samuel said, grabbing his arm. "Don't." Thomas met his gaze. "She deserves peace. We all do." He lit the first lamp. The flame flared gold and wild. Then he threw it against the parlor wall. Oil splattered, catching instantly. The fire crawled upward, licking the portraits, devouring the gold frames. The house screamed. Not creaked, screamed. Samuel covered his ears, stumbling back as the floorboards buckled. Smoke filled the room, thick and black. Through the rising flames, Thomas saw her again, his mother, her form clearer now, her face soft, almost human. She extended a hand to him. "It's done, my son," she whispered. "You freed me." The fire roared between them. Thomas coughed, falling to his knees. The heat was unbearable, the air like knives in his lungs. Samuel grabbed him, dragging him toward the door. The ceiling gave way behind them, sparks flying like angry stars. They burst into the rain, collapsing on the soaked ground as the Beaumont house burned the inferno, lighting the storm-dark sky. From the field, the surviving servants watched silently. No one spoke. The flames reflected in their eyes like prophecy fulfilled. Thomas lifted his head, watching the roof collapse inward. He thought he saw her standing in the window for one final instant, smiling. Then she was gone, swallowed by fire. Samuel put a trembling hand on his shoulder. "It's over." Thomas shook his head weakly. "No, it's beginning. The name ends here, but I'll carry her truth." Behind them, the house that had held so many secrets fell with a sound like thunder, and when dawn broke over the ruins, the air was clear for the first time in decades. The Beaumont curse had been buried in its own ashes, and for the first time, the land was silent. The dawn after the fire came gray and quiet. A mist rolled low across the fields, swallowing the last embers that smoldered in the wreckage. The Beaumont plantation, once the grandest estate in the county, was now nothing but a blackened skeleton. Charred beams jutted from the earth like broken ribs. The air smelled of soot, rain, and release. Thomas stood barefoot among the ruins, his clothes stiff with smoke, his hair singed at the edges. Every breath hurt. The night's fever still clung to him, but his eyes were clear, haunted, yes, but alive. Samuel sat a few yards away, his arm wrapped in a torn bandage. He had saved Thomas from the collapsing staircase, dragging him through fire and smoke. His skin blistered where the heat had licked him. Now, he stared into the ashes with a kind of hollow awe. "She's gone," he said at last, voice rough as gravel. "The house, the name, all of it." Thomas didn't answer. He was looking at the horizon, where the faintest red glow still burned the final breath of the Beaumont curse. "She's not gone," he murmured. "She's free." By midday, the neighbors began to arrive, white planters from miles around, drawn by the sight of the smoke that had painted the night sky. They came on horseback, their faces pinched with suspicion and fear. "What happened here?" one demanded. "Where's the judge?" Thomas met their eyes with quiet defiance. "Dead," he said simply. "Buried with his sins." The men looked past him, to the smoldering ruin. "Did you do this, boy?" another asked, hand resting on his pistol. Before Thomas could speak, Samuel rose, his back straight despite the pain. "I did," he said. The judge's cruelty caught up to him. The house turned on itself. "You'd do well to leave it be." The men exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard whispers about the Beaumont line, about strange deaths, restless servants, and a mistress who had vanished years ago. Now the whispers had turned to smoke. None dared step closer. One of them spat into the dirt. "Let it rot then," he said, tugging his reins. "There's curses in that blood." By sunset, they were gone. Only Thomas, Samuel, and the surviving slaves remained standing silent before the ruin of the great house that had ruled and ruined their lives. That night, Thomas walked to the edge of the property, where a single willow tree bent low over a shallow pool of rainwater. He knelt there, clutching his mother's locket. The metal was warm against his skin, as though it carried the memory of her touch. He opened it inside. The portrait was cracked but visible. A woman's calm eyes, her smile faint but kind. "She's at peace now," Samuel said behind him. Thomas turned. "And what about us?" Samuel hesitated. "We start again. Maybe not here. Maybe not with this name. But we live. That's more than most got." Thomas looked back toward the ashes. "The name ends tonight," he said quietly. "Beaumont dies here. My mother will not be forgotten. But the blood that built this place, it ends with me." Samuel nodded. He seemed both proud and broken. "Then we'll leave at dawn." They buried the locket beneath the willow before leaving. Thomas pressed his palm into the dirt. "Rest," he whispered. "No more walls. No more secrets." The ground felt cool and steady, as if the land itself had sighed in relief. They left with only what they could carry: a small satchel, a harmonica Samuel had kept from his youth, and the clothes on their backs. The road stretched wide before them, framed by cypress and smoke. For miles, neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy but not hostile, the silence of men who had survived something sacred and terrible. When they reached the crossroads, Samuel stopped. "There's a freedman's town down by the river," he said. "People building new lives. Might take us in." Thomas looked back one last time. The plantation was barely visible through the mist, just a dark smear against the rising sun. "I don't ever want to see it again," he said. Samuel nodded. "Then you won't." Years passed. The land where Beaumont Manor once stood became overgrown, a tangle of vines and wildflowers. Travelers who passed through said the soil there never hardened enough for crops, and that on stormy nights, you could still see a woman's shadow in the lightning, standing in the ruins, humming to herself. They said the ground glowed faintly where the house had burned, that if you listened close enough, you could hear a lullaby. Thomas never went back. He built a small school in the riverside settlement, a place for children who had been born in bondage but would die free. He taught them to read, to write, to remember. On the wall above the chalkboard hung a single thing, a copy of his mother's portrait, redrawn from memory. He told her story not as tragedy, but as warning and as hope. When Samuel grew old, he would sit outside the schoolhouse in a rocking chair, watching the children play. He never spoke of the fire. He never had to. The lines in his face told it all. One summer evening, as the sun bled orange over the river, Thomas sat beside him. "Do you ever wonder if we did the right thing?" he asked. Samuel smiled faintly. "I don't wonder, boy. I know. The dead don't haunt peace, only guilt, and we ain't got none left." They sat in silence until the light faded. The air was warm and still. Somewhere in the distance, a harmonica played soft and slow, a melody Thomas had never learned but somehow knew by heart. He closed his eyes. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of what dreams might come. Years later, when Thomas himself grew gray, he returned once more to that willow. The ruins were gone, reclaimed by earth. Fireflies danced in the dark. He knelt, pressed his hand into the soil again, and whispered the same word his mother had spoken in death. Done. The ground was quiet, the air gentle. The Beaumont line had ended not in blood, but in peace. And somewhere, perhaps in the soft hush between thunder and rain, a mother's voice whispered back, "At last." By the time the century turned, no one alive remembered the face of Thomas Beaumont. The name had faded from records, the mansion long since devoured by ivy and time. Yet in the Low Country near Charleston, old people still spoke of the cursed plantation that learned mercy. It began as whispers. Farmers said their mules refused to plow that patch of earth. Surveyors marked it on maps as abandoned land, though none could explain why grass grew so thick there when no seed had been sown for decades. On summer nights, travelers swore they saw a lantern glowing beneath a willow tree that had grown enormous, its branches sweeping low like a shroud. Sometimes they heard faint humming a tune, too soft to be wind, too human to be accident. The locals called it Widow's Rest. They said if you stood by the water and spoke a truth you were too afraid to tell another soul, the swamp would take it and you'd leave lighter. But if you came with lies in your heart, the mud would bubble, and the air would thicken, and you'd feel unseen eyes watching until you ran. No one could say who began that legend. But the freedmen's settlement down by the river had their own story. They told of a man named Thomas who once taught their grandparents to read, a man who refused to take anyone's last name, who built the school with his own hands and spent every night at a small desk writing in a leather-bound journal. When asked what he was writing, he always said, "A way to remember." After he died, the journal disappeared. Some said he buried it beneath the willow. Others claimed a stranger, a pale woman in a gray dress, came to the schoolhouse one night and took it, leaving behind a single brass button on the windowsill. By 1903, the land that had once been the Beaumont estate was purchased by a banker from Savannah. He planned to build a new house, a grand one with marble floors and imported chandeliers. Construction began in spring. By autumn, his workers had all quit. They said the foundation kept sinking, that at night their tools vanished, that one morning they found all their nails bent into crosses. The banker laughed it off until his youngest son, a curious boy of 7, wandered into the swamp one evening and returned before dawn, dripping wet, holding a harmonica. He said a man with gray eyes had given it to him and told him to remember the sound of truth. The banker sold the land a week later. No one built there again. By the 1,932nd, only the willow remained. Its trunk was thick as a house, its roots gripping the earth like a sleeping giant. During floods, it was the last thing visible above the water, a green crown in a sea of brown. Children from the town nearby would sneak out on dares, daring each other to touch the tree. Most turned back before they reached it, claiming they heard footsteps behind them. The few who did make it said the air around it was strangely warm, even in winter. A teacher named Miss Halloway once took her class there on a field trip. She told them the story of a man who broke a curse, not with fire, but forgiveness. History, she said, has two kinds of ghosts, the kind that haunt and the kind that teach. This place is the second kind. Her students laughed, but when she turned back to the willow, her eyes softened. "Listen," she said quietly. "You can still hear them." The children strained their ears, and in the rustling leaves, they swore they heard a lullaby. Time rolled on. Wars came and went. Roads carved through the countryside, and cities rose from swamps. Yet that patch of land remained untouched. By the 1,982nd, it had become a wildlife reserve. Biologists studied the soil and found it unusually fertile, rich in minerals and moisture, but with traces of ash deep beneath the surface. One researcher noted that it seems the land itself remembers fire, yet flourishes because of it. Local guides began telling the story again, this time as folklore. Tourists came to see the singing willow and left offerings at its base: coins, letters, even wedding rings. Some claimed that when they returned home, the things they feared most had lost their hold. One summer evening, a young historian named Clara Beaumont visited the site. She had traced her lineage through old court records and discovered, to her shock, that she descended from both the master and the enslaved. She stood before the willow, trembling. The air smelled of rain and moss. In her hands, she held a faded photograph of the school her ancestor Thomas had built by the river. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for all of it." A breeze stirred the branches, and something small fell at her feet, a brass button, tarnished but whole. She stared at it for a long moment before kneeling and pressing it into the earth. "Thank you," she murmured. That night, locals said the willow shone faintly under the moonlight, as though the earth itself had exhaled. Years later, Clara's book Ashes of the Beaumont line became a quiet success. She didn't write it as revenge or confession, but as remembrance. In her final chapter, she wrote, "Is greater than, the sins of our fathers may build the walls that cage us, but it is the mercy of their children that tears them down. The land does not forget, but it forgives when we do." And beneath her words, she printed a single line from a forgotten journal found sealed in the schoolhouse wall. "Is greater than, freedom is not the opposite of bondage. It is the peace that comes when the earth stops whispering the names of the dead." To this day, the willow stands. Its branches cradle the wind. Some nights, when the air is still, you can hear the faint sound of a harmonica playing a melody no one alive remembers learning. And if you walk close enough, the ground hums softly under your feet, not in warning, but in welcome. The Beaumont curse had ended long ago, but the land remembers mercy, and in that remembering, it keeps the promise made beneath its roots.